Hey kids, and welcome to the beginning of the Napoleon series. First off, I would like to state that the gameplay footage for all of these videos will most likely not be representative of the campaigns. I have tried to find and recreate this footage using games such as Wars of Napoleon and Victory and Glory Napoleon, but it can be pretty haphazard. So let's get right into the first video, the 1812 French invasion of Russia. The Peninsular War and Russian campaign were the last major campaigns undertaken by Napoleon at the height of his power, with the latter campaign being the main contributor to the downfall of France at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It also contributed to my favourite meme in military history. The Russian campaign is a story of attrition, cold, bad supply and scorched earth tactics, and this war, along with the Swedish War of 1707, serves as a reminder for any subsequent warlord that fighting a war during the Russian winter is generally a very bad idea, and trying to get to Moscow during this winter is an even worse idea. You ignorant git! So, executive summary for you guys. Nappy gets pissy at Alexander I for not flipping off the British, decides to invade Russia, gets repeatedly gangbanged by supply issues, Cossacks in the Battle of Borodino, reaches Moscow, realizes everything was for fuck all, and buggers off back home. Now, let's get right into the nitty gritty. First off, let's look at the causes. The continental system or blockade is the first and most cited reason for the Russian campaign. The continental system was a product of the Berlin Decree of 1806, a law issued by Napoleon after the Battle of Vienna. This system basically told every country in Europe that was allied or a satellite of France they were not allowed to trade with Britain. Problem is, the system didn't really work. Now, some industries that don't rely on imported goods, such as agriculture, managed to flourish without British goods getting in there, but a lot of production started to fail due to lack of importation, which was also compounded by Britain's counter law, the Orders of Council, in the same year, which said none of Britain's allies could trade with France. Essentially, any industry that relied on receiving imported goods to produce a product started to fail. This led to inflated prices for those same products. Turns out, when you tell one of the most industrialized nations to bugger off, there's some penalties. Who'd have thunk it? A year later, after Napoleon won the Battle of Friedland and ended the war at the Fourth Coalition, the King of Prussia, Friedrich William III, and the Russian Tsar Alexander I signed the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. This had two things. The first was that Prussia had to cede a bunch of Polish territories to France, and the second was that Russia was to enter into an alliance with Napoleon and also go into the continental system. Is this gay? No homo, comrade. France, in turn, promised to help out Russia in an ongoing war against the Ottomans. This put Russia out of the European spotlight for a few years. They had a naval war with Britain until 1812, but this was mostly just the effects of the continental system. Now, through this time, the Russian trade started to feel the heat from the economical bloc by exports failing up to 40%, primarily grain and lumber. Naturally, this pissed off the nobles and made them resentful towards the French. This was coupled with Napoleon not giving the help he promised against the Ottomans. Fed up with all this crap and wanting to appease the nobles that wanted the exports to resume so they could afford their luxuries, Russia decided to stop the continental bullshit and left the system in 1810. Important to note is that Russia did not officially exit the system, as in giving Napoleon notice, they just sort of stopped enforcing it, and trade started to grow again. When Napoleon got wind of this, he didn't really like it, but his attention was mainly focused on dealing with Austria. It is important to note that the political tension was also growing between France and Russia over Poland. Basically, Napoleon created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw from territory taken from the Prussians from Tilsit, and since the Russians absolutely hated Poland, the idea of or possibility of a new Polish kingdom created by France started to piss them off even more. Now, this is not really a direct cause, but it did heavily contribute to anti-French sentiment in Russia. In 1809, when the War of the Fifth Coalition ended and the Treaty of Schönbrunn was signed, Austria ceded Western Galicia to Warsaw, further pissing off the Russians. To sum this all up, Napoleon wanted to flex his dick. Russia leaving the continental system and the tensions over the Duchy of Warsaw made everyone realize that shit was about to hit the fan. So, by early January 1812, the armies started to mobilize. The primary goal of the campaign was to defeat the Russian army in a show of the Grand Army's power and force Alexander to the negotiating table where Napoleon could demand anything he wanted. Napoleon had never planned to go to Moscow. He was recorded saying to an Austrian foreign minister, Metternich, that the campaign would only go as far as Smolensk and Minsk. He would set up his headquarters at Vilnius for administrative duties into Lithuania. Now, we all know that supplies are an issue for any campaign, and initially the preparations for this seemed to be up to scratch. The armies had lived off the land while stationed in Prussia prior to the campaign and did not eat out of the main magazine of supplies, and massive stockpiles were constructed by the Polish border. The supplies of the campaign were sufficient and he had plenty and more for future operations, but the problem was transportation, and we'll get into that a bit later. The Emperor's army was pretty well organised, although the exact number is not well known and sources vary. A 650,000 average can be assumed for the total of the Grand Armée, but for the campaign itself he utilised about 450,000 and left the rest on the border. The army system was fairly standard. It was broken down into large groups consisting of 2 or 3 corps, and each group had a respective duty. Without getting too much into detail, it allowed for a massive frontline force, a pair of flanking groups, and a reserve group. Needless to say, the army had some of its best commanders such as Ney, Oudinot, Davout, and Murat. I don't think I pronounced any of those names correctly. We can't really say the same thing for the Russian army. At the beginning of the campaign it was split in 2. Closer to Napoleon was the larger First Army commanded by Barclay de Tolly, who was also the primary commander for the timing, and the Second Army under Bagrations was much further south by Brest. Napoleon's plan was an attempt to capitulate on this distance. Essentially his goal was to trap Bagrations' army against the Pripyat marshes by driving to Vilnius where Tolly was stationed. This would allow Napoleon to defeat the armies one at a time. With the supply stockpiles completed and the armies organised, Napoleon officially declared war on the 22nd of June and called it the Second Polish War. On the 23rd of June, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River close to Kovno, or Kaunas. He hoped to encounter a large amount of Russians, but when he got word that his advance forces were only encountering skirmishing units, he realised that Tolly and Bagration were retreating towards Vilnius. The initial plan was simple. Marshal MacDonald and the 10th Corps would swing to the north by Riga to guard the northern flank, while Schwarzenberg's group approached from the south to guard the southern flank, and the Central Army under Napoleon's direct command moved east to Vilnius. His plan had to involve a forced march before the armies could unite at Vilnius, so he sent Beauharnais' group to guard the rear and got Jerome with his group to attack Bagration and pin him against the marshes by Grodno. The push to Vilnius was a hint of the coming campaign. The soldiers had to deal with intense heat that choked them with dust and torrential rains that froze them to the bone. I mentioned the supply issue earlier. Although the supply caches were huge and Napoleon correctly guessed that the lands would be too barren for his soldiers to live off, the supply wagons simply could not make it to the advanced lines. It's estimated that the army had 25,000 wagons and just under 100,000 animals, but the constantly changing weather broke the system and the march beyond Vilnius exacerbated the problem. The first few days of the campaign were unbearably hot and would kill a multitude of soldiers by heat stroke. The heat would turn to rain and would turn the roads into swamps, where more soldiers would die because they threw clothing away because of the heat, and when the infantry passed through and messed up the mud, the sun would come up and turn the roads into canyons. Broken wheels and broken horse legs were incredibly commonplace, and this was made worse by the fact that a supply convoy had to try and catch up with an infantry column moving at a forced march. Obviously, this caused huge delays, and only about 250,000 men crossed the Niemen River at the beginning of the campaign due to these logistical constraints. The rest were to trickle through in the coming days and weeks. Eugene, Jerome, and Murat all suffered massive delays, and this would prove costly for the coming operations. After 2 days of marching through weather that makes fucking Melbourne look tame, Napoleon reached Vilnius hoping to expect a Russian force. Problem is, the Russians saw the fortifications and knew they could be easily outflanked, so Barclay burnt the supply stores, crossed the bridge, burnt the bridge, and then fucked off out of there. On the 28th of June, Napoleon entered Vilnius without a fight. Reports as to the reactions of the inhabitants vary. Some say that the inhabitants cried with joy in seeing the national French flags unfurled, while others said that nobody really gave a shit and that everything was gloomy. Napoleon was rip-roaringly pissed. On the 1st of July, while stationed at Vilnius, Balashev, a Russian diplomat, delivered a negotiation letter from Alexander to Napoleon. Balashev witnessed typical Napoleonic ranting. Napoleon knew that the letter was just a front to show the world that Alexander was not the aggressor, and in this rant, Napoleon blamed the Russians for not evacuating Prussia at one point and said that the war was entirely the fault of the Russians and that he would throw them into the icy wastes. At one point he got so pissed, he ripped off a window shutter and punted it outside. Here's the weird thing though. In a letter Napoleon gave to Balashev to give to Alexander, Napoleon was still professing friendship and a desire to talk, which it's a little bit late for that, buddy. I mean, if I was Napoleon at that point, I would be destroying hotel property as well, because by the time he reached Vilnius, the loss of life was completely insane. Over 5,000 horses had died on the journey, and one report said that a further 9,000 died in a single night. This would most likely be the storm on the 29th of June, where hailstorms and cold had also killed several soldiers. By September, he would only have 30,000 horses remaining, less than half of what he left with at Kaunas. And if we are to go by this adaptation of our losses chart, we can see that Napoleon lost about 22,000 men on the journey. So when you're losing your cavalry and men due to desertions and attrition and not really any actual battles, you're going to be pretty fucking pissed. Now, there was one glimmer of hope. Bagration was still south of Vilnius at this point, so Napoleon sent out Davout and Jerome to trap Bagration and take out the army. Davout was to split out his force and attack the front and rear of the Russian army near a town called Ochmiana, while Jerome acted as a hammer against the anvil. Problem is, Bagration escaped and was now heading to Minsk. Essentially, a combination of Jerome being incredibly slow due to bad supplies and conflicting enemy concentration reports kind of muddled the entire plan. Bagration learned of Davout's position, altered his route towards Bobruisk, and managed to avoid getting destroyed. Napoleon only learned of the escape of Bagration on the 5th of July and promptly ripped his brother a new asshole. Now that Bagration was gone, Napoleon turned his attention to Barclay, who was last seen heading in the direction of Drissa.